you guys anyway. So, but it was fun. I mean, I have a very good memory of that occasion. Since then, we've continued this. And of course, it's not the world. We're more familiar with 100 days in office, which is, we're more familiar with 100 days in office, which is, I guess, a tradition also initiated somewhere in 1933, in the sense of on the right signal. So the first 100 days were supposed to like set the right tone for your government, show the momentum, energy, maybe your priorities. But after 1 year, you're supposed to have settled in, right? So I think, especially here where we basically campaign 24/7 every day of every year for the 4 year period, one expects that politics will probably and campaigning might intervene shortly. So for every president, actually 1 year is significant. It's probably more than we care for assessing how a government is performing. And we're happy this year also um, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, before we get started, I should do the formal and the right things and friends as well. We're excited that you're able to join together in terms of a performance assessment so far. And with that, I would like to welcome the CDD team, Dr. Kojo Asante, Mr. Darubonsu, and Professor Nsiedu to kick us off. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just. I'm going to need the podium, sir. Okay. All right. Thank you, and very good afternoon to everyone. So, some challenges with our team, but Daryl, who is from Arocha, an environmental governance think tank, been doing a lot of good work on the Galamsey fake in some place that I'm not sure he'll be here on time. So I'm just trying to see if Professor Magashi, who is supposed to do, if you can put the presentation on. So what we are going to go through is our assessment of the John Mahama first year in office. This is the second coming of John Mahama, like Jesus, you know. So we are assessing this across 6 thematic areas: democracy and governance, anti-corruption and accountability, environment, social development, defense and security, foreign affairs, and economy and jobs. And governance. And then Professor Nsedi was to take the economy and jobs, and Darrell would focus on just the environment. So I'll take you through that presentation. When we are done, we'll get our discussants to make 10 minutes intervention. we've kind of looked at gray material, government documents, statistical material, and then of course the assessors themselves are people who have been working in this area for a while. So what you are going to hear from us is drawn from all these. Okay, all right. So let's talk about democracy, governance, human rights, and okay. All right. Okay. So the landscape that I mentioned. If you look at trust ratings for the president, for example, the round 10, 11, round 10 Afrobarometer was showing 28% of citizens trusted the president. And normally, so the question is asked, do you trust the president? 28 would say yes, a lot or somewhat. And that's 28. And that's actually one of the lowest, actually the lowest trust rating since the Afrobarometer started in 1999. And Ghana's democratic quality was declining. If you look at Mo Ibrahim, Perception Index, Varieties of Democracy in the West Africa regions, you had transition challenges in multiple constituencies, a lot of violence, judicial trust deficit following heavy criticism of the Akufo-Addo era judiciary. Presidential state transitions were also marred by constitutional and legal gaps. Government's commitment was that they were going to cap the ministers and deputies to 60. This had been a debate that was running during the election. Establish a constitutional review committee, establish a governance advisory council, promote press freedom, repeal anti-press laws, hold MMDC on non-partisan basis. Some of the positives that we can talk about is, of course, the publication of a code of conduct to regulate appointees. We also saw a lot of very good signaling from President Mahama, giving this idea of the reset that, engagement with citizens, operating an open door policy, being a listening government, all of those things. I think in 2025 you began to see, and I give an example of the engagement around the lithium agreement, for instance, or the application of the SML contracts. We know the Constitutional Review Committee was also established. We had active CSO engagement and participation, the preparation of the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan, and so on. And then also, typically what you always find with change in government is whether or not government will continue with projects of the previous government. We saw some positive signs with the Ofankor and Sawem road, also based on the agitation from citizens, and basically the president's openness to feedback and policy reversals. Challenges and structural gaps that we have to mention. I talked about the whole violence around the transition. So we saw marauding NDC affiliated groups storming public installations. Ghana Gas was, emblematic of that, where they had to fire warning shots and so on. And then the Presidential Transition Act really failed to deal with the transition at the middle and lower levels. I think since it was passed, I think we all see the presidential teams, it's all cordial, everybody's smiling, but at the middle and on the ground, there's just chaos and people are fighting over everything. So there are issues, and then we also focus very much at national level. We forget that, the transition is not just a presidential transition, but it's a state transition. So that doesn't seem to have really addressed those issues. And then, of course, we don't seem to get any of these criminal acts actually punished or people held accountable. Then we've had the incoming government's revocation of last-minute appointments made after January 7th. This has been an ongoing transition issue. Directives to MMDCs to hand over to DCDs, and we know that sometimes it creates a power vacuum at local level. We have mass removal of CEOs and boards essentially halting, in many cases, a lot of the operations of these entities. And then we also saw some policy coordination challenges. The cabinet secretary had to issue a formal directive to ministers not to be making policy pronouncements that had not been agreed in cabinet. We have stated the education minister's mother tongue in the early instruction, and even the OSP Private Act, Private Members Bill, that was later on withdrawn. Also to mention the application of pretrial detention and bail powers by security agencies, particularly the issue of arrest, detention, bail conditions were also an issue, and perceived abuse of those powers. I want to draw on issues of checks and balances. We know that, as we said, the NDC had a two-thirds majority in Parliament, and this is not, in terms of the positives, this is not necessarily an action that happened in 2025, but I think Parliament has to be commended for the standing orders, the progressive standing orders that regulating Okada, cryptocurrency, the regulating Okada, cryptocurrency, the bills imposing 1 CD on petroleum products. These are significant, bills that needed engagement with citizens. So that is engagement with citizens. So that is an area that I think we have to really watch. On the judiciary side, we know that the judiciary was suffering from this trust. But the Afrobarometer has shown popular perceptions of the judiciary. But we also know that the NDC have ramped up judicial criticism throughout the 2024 election and has flagged the appointment of judges onto the bench, particularly the perception that they were sympathetic to the MPP. And we know in March 2025, President Mahama triggered this Article 146 process to respond to petitions seeking the removal of the Chief Justice. And we went through that process in September 1st, 2025. The removal of the Chief Justice was announced. I mean, everybody understands that this was significant, unprecedented in the Fourth Republic. And though we all have affirmed that the letter of the law was adhered to by the president, I think a number of issues I think need to be considered. So first of all, there was an opportunity at the end of the process, given that this was unprecedented, given that the integrity of the judiciary was at stake, that at least the report of the committee and its reasoning and its grounds needed to be shared to the public. Of course, if you go through 146, the Supreme Court has affirmed, that it can't look into the process, that it was almost non-justiciable in that process. And every attempt to look into the matter during the process was rejected. But I think at the end of the process, nothing stopped us from sharing that, so that Ghanaians can affirm in their minds that the process was fair and just, and so on. So I would say it's still not too late to share a copy of that report. But there are other issues that came up of the process that have to be resolved. So Justice Tokonu, for example, raised questions about human rights violations, natural justice violations in the process. The problem with that process is that it has finality. So if your issues are not addressed during the process, after the process, you have no recourse to any court. And that raises real questions about the natural justice implications. Even going to the Human Rights Court, the Human Rights Court also couldn't look into the process because they felt that it was not just, they had to wait till the process was done. Another issue that we flagged was that there's a lot of conflict of interest issues with the way 146 is set up, because you have justices from the Supreme Court that are supposed to go and sit in the committee. You can bring a case to the Supreme Court challenging the process, and people may have to sit in. So it just wasn't neat. And it's something that we have to really address going forward. But we have always made the point that the issue is not just about who is in the seat as Chief Justice. The issue has to do with the governance architecture that we have established around the judiciary. And giving the Chief Justice a very expanded administrative power that is not fettered in certain ways to empanel, to have a very important role in transfers, in promotion, and so on, creates that uncertainty for the political class that this person can be interfered with. So we have to do something about, because in other places, empaneling can be done by lottery. It can be done by ways in which it makes it more independent. So these are issues that I think we have to, but fortunately, the Constitutional Review Committee has made very substantive proposals around appointment and removal, because you have to tackle both in terms of the independence to give people comfort that whoever judicial independence is secured. I wanted to add a few things on electoral reforms. So one of the issues that has come up, which has added to our problems around election, is that we've already had problems around the results management. We've seen that has occurred again in 2024. But there are new issues that have come up. The question is, where does the Electoral Commission's process end? And when does the court step in? Because we saw in many cases where the results process was truncated. And then it was a question as to whether it's within the Electoral Commission to determine what next, or we have to go to court. And these are very serious matters that have to be resolved by all of us if we are going to avoid, creating very bad incentives for how we manage our elections going forward. So I flagged it that it's something that's important that we have to address. On human rights generally, I think the concern, we have to commend, as I said, the signaling has been good in terms of engagement with citizens, media, but the issues of violence against media still persist. We even just recently, the GJA had a press conference. How are we going to deal with this and really put a stop to the violence against journalists? So those issues are still not being addressed, and we have to sort of find a way. The other issue is the arrest and detention of content creators, people who have been deemed to have made false statements online. And it really brings the question about the adjudication or the governance of the digital space into mind. Currently we have about 15 billion from the Ministry of Communication seeking to regulate all of these aspects of the digital space. I think that's where we should put our energy in trying to define a legal regime that respects human rights, because generally speech, criminalizing speech, we already repealed criminal libel law. But criminalizing speech in this way can, impact on whistleblowers. It will make people hesitate, even if they heard something, to say that it's targeted that, if you say something about a government official. People insult each other and call false news about each other all the time. You don't hear the police going to arrest other people. So we really need to address this, because in 2025, there was quite a lot of these issues that's come up. On the human rights side, of course, we know that the the anti-LGBT bill is also back on the floor of Parliament. The anti-LGBT bill is also back on the floor of Parliament. We have made the point that the constitutional defects in that law has still not been addressed, and we were expecting that government would take responsibility to try to address all of the challenges that that particular bill, because that bill basically out chapter, chapter 5 of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And so it's still being handled as a private member's bill with the old content. And we believe that at the end, it would offend, we believe that at the end, it would offend almost every right that citizens have: association, speech. Even media people cannot talk about it. I mean, how do you, Parliament cannot even interfere. How can Parliament stop itself from looking into any matter, no matter how obnoxious we think it presents to us? Quickly, so that I can move on. For local government, I think the 2025 year was really focused on trying to develop the sort of the policy and legal space for a more radical engagement on the local governance scene. Government did very well in ensuring that the releases to the District Assembly Common Fund was going. I mean, that was making sure that at least 80% of that was going. And of course, we should understand that from 2022 to 2024, these were very strained, periods financially. There was a lot of caps on statutory funds and so on and so forth. So we're getting decap between 40 and 50. So restoring that and making sure that funds were going to the MMDAs, I think, was a very important thing. But a lot of the other thing was developing the framework and how are we going to make local government work. Afrobarometer CDD surveys have already shown that people just don't believe that our local government system is functional and it delivers. So we now have the amendment of the Public Financial Management Act to ensure that there is these issues. But we see the shortcomings. They give problem, sourcing issues, the IMF Ghana diagnostic said sole sourcing, accounted for 40%. Again, we are not seeing how that is being controlled. Oral, at the time, people raised questions about its overlaps with other existing anti-corruption institutions. We haven't seen the conduct of public officers bill, which was supposed to this use of nolle prosequi to deal with some matters pending before. This has been raised as being selective, and therefore it's created some legitimacy issues for the AG. And then, of course, we also have seen that there's a lot of tension among the anti-corruption institutions, particularly on the AG side. We've seen the OSP and so on. So a house divided, of course, would not survive if it goes on that way. All right. So foreign affairs, I think President Mahama signaled very early when he came into office that our relationships with our neighbors, particularly the Sahelian states, Burkina Faso was going to be an important issue for the government. We know what was going on in the sub-region. Some of his earlier visits when he assumed office were to these places to try to reassert the good neighborliness policy that we have had for our foreign affairs for many, many years. And he appointed a special envoy to the Sahel. They introduced KPIs for ambassadors, heads of missions. He also sort of pursued this Pan-African solidarity policy where, cocoa products were donated to the Gaza as part of the humanitarian effort. We've sent the engineers to Jamaica in the post-hurricane period. So all of these things, so these elements have been very, very, very clear in terms of our foreign policy. And then we also know that Ghana, as the AU champion, continuing on what President Akufo-Addo also started, we've seen how we have institutionalized and deepened the return year of the now the Black Star experience and so on and so forth. So this has been really some of the hallmarks of the foreign affairs that the Mahama government has pursued. But we don't have a real sense of what the comprehensive picture, how are we conducting our foreign affairs. There was this commitment to have a framework, and it's not been published, so we don't know. We know some KPIs have been given to ambassadors, but we don't know what it is. And then also, good neighborliness doctrine seemed to be increasingly Sahel-centric, right? Which also risk neglecting other strategic neighbors. So because there's this tension between the Sahel and some of our coastal neighbors like Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and so on and so forth, we are playing this very interesting dance in terms of how we handle the two of them. Ambassador Labo is here, so I'm hoping that he can shed some more light on this. But that has also created coordination issues for how we engage with ECOWAS, because that is part of the trust deficit that is currently existing in the sub-region. So it's creating some tensions in terms of the government's commitment to just be pragmatic. You have terrorism at your door. You have to respond to the challenges that are coming. But at the same time, you want to respect regional cooperation and be able to, be at peace with everybody. Also, in terms of the foreign affairs, there's been this constant challenge with the appointment of political appointees and career diplomats and the balance. And it seems that we are tilting more and more towards more political appointees than career. And then now we have deputy ambassadors as well. And sometimes you can have both of them as political appointees. And I think, the foreign affairs have to really go back to its old traditions and really reflect on that, because in a very complex geopolitical environment as we are, we really need, real knowledge and capacity to be able to navigate this environment. There are also transparency gaps in sensitive bilateral agreements, including migration, deportation, and we've seen some of the recent decision to accept Africans, who have been deported from the US and so on. How are we doing these agreements? What kind of transparency should we have? Should Parliament have more role in looking at these things? And then also we've been very outspoken in trying to assert our support for global norms and rules and so on and so forth. And holding that space, being a little more outspoken about these things. We made issue statements on Venezuela, we issue statement on Gaza. We have even called our African neighbors like Tanzania and so on to order and all of that stuff. And it's a question, yes, you are Ghana, you have soft power and so on, but how do you manage, if you also get retaliation? How are you going to deal with this very careful dance of being assertive and leading the Pan-African solidarity and dignity of the African and all of those things that we want to do that? But how are we strategically managing? How would we respond when we are also when people begin to also take their own actions against us? Lastly, on defense and security, just so that I'll finish my part, I think the key challenges that we have with domestically, of course, is the land conflicts, the chieftaincy conflicts, most of them that are linked. Boko is an ongoing one, and really the challenge of trying to mitigate, resolve these conflicts, and the cost that it is imposing on us. Because now we've sort of moved from some sort of, episodic, sporadic engagement to more having boots on the ground, having, units in all these conflict zones. But as has been shown, Boku Security Task Force was costing 6 million a month, and that's, I don't know even if that's a conservative estimate. But how many, you are sending 400 troops to conflict, to that? How are you going to, sustain this over time? What are we doing in investing in really the preventative parts, the conflict resolution parts, and so on? I think there's also a lot of work that the government was trying to do with really trying to formalize the whole security architecture and bring it to sort of to have more accountability around it. So currently the national security budget transferred to Ministry of Interior, because the Ministry of Interior is also serves as the national security minister. And maybe that brings it more into the purview of Parliament. But we really need to resolve this architecture. I think everybody has to accept that, yes, we need much more scrutiny and supervision of our security activities. So any way in which that architecture is properly institutionalized to allow for parliamentary oversight and so on in spending and all of that, that has to be addressed. Yes, now we have NIMOS, that is sort of doing continuous enforcement. We also, there's this effort to have an audit of the security service and the objective is to end politicization. And this is very serious, but it's something that we need to understand exactly how this is going to be done. And from how do you sustain it beyond one regime, and so on. So there are challenges with prison overcrowding. There's a Community Service Act that have been promised. It is still on the table. That would ensure that people who have committed, misdemeanor, minor crimes, and so on, they can do community service. We still have farmer-herder conflicts and so on that we have to do. And then the crash that happened in August 2025, the helicopter crash, we also then began to see the challenges with the current state of our equipment. So this is basically, I'm doing quite a lot in terms of covering. I forgot that I have to do a bit of the social development before Dario comes in. So I'll do that. Professor Techua reminded me, I hope you're going to talk about gender, because Dr. Gafaru is here, who is the expert on social protection. So actually, I'm going to even leave the social protection issue so that you can really delve into that. But on education, I think the good news is that we are back to looking at basic education. For a number of years, Free SHS basically absorbed everything. It absorbed all our resources. But if the foundation is weak, it doesn't matter what you put on it, you are not going to get the learning outcomes that we want. So historic 9.1 billion allocation to basic education, capitation, and then this was all the challenges with financing of education. At least we're back to looking at that. And then we've also seen the no academic fee policy issues. And then trying to deal with double track. But we know that double track is going to take a while to really, given the numbers that are being rolled on every year. So the real issue for education is really how do we get a balance between basic education and higher education if we don't get a foundation right. The gender issues, now we have the affirmative action law. I think a lot has been done by the gender ministry this year trying to really operationalize. I know the gender equity committee now has been established. The LI have been discussed as, if I recall, the issue of the distribution of sanitary pads to school-going girls. But there are issues, of course, still with support systems for violence against gender-based violence and all of that. So it's, yes, we have law. How do we institutionalize? I just saw, Prof, I think you sent me that the government said we should enforce the 30% or so allocate to gender allocation. But again, that has been said. How is that being enforced? So it's more moving from the law to operationalization. And then on health, I think my colleague Kwame Sapon-Siedu is online. Again, it's about just restoring the financial stress that was occurring in health, uncapping the NHIL so that primary health care can be covered. So most of what has happened in 2025 is just even trying to stabilize the financing to these sectors because of the financial strain from the previous year. And a lot now is going to be expected in terms of how free primary health care is rolled out, and also how the Mahama Care, the Ghana Medical Trust, what is going to be its linkage with the NHIS, for example, in terms of the funding arrangements, because non-communicable diseases is really the big challenge. it's a very, very expensive, so if money is going to be made available to cover these things, how are they speaking to each, how are they integrated? Otherwise, we will miss the point. So thank you very much. There's a lot of issues to cover, and I hope that in the conversation we can do more of that. I think I'll now invite Darrell.
It has become like a raging wildfire that can't seem to be tamed. And I'm going to try and do a presentation coming from when the government took office in 2025, what it used to be, where we are now, the actions they've taken, and some of the key proposals, the gaps that we've seen, and some of the key proposals we think can bring about change. And let me start by maybe hitting on the fact that you recall that somewhere in the beginning of 2025, the government did talk about the fact that when they took office, there were about 45 forest reserves that were seriously affected. I mean, these are very key indicators I want to put out there before I get into the very detail. 45 forest reserves that were affected by mining, and also indicated that 9 of them were actually red zones, to the extent that the Forestry Commission that was responsible for managing these forest reserves had no access because of the armed gangs who were actively operating in these areas. At the end of the year, 2025, we have on record 50 forest reserves now impacted by illegal mining. One would have expected that with measures that have been put in place, we should have seen significant reduction or even stopped the encroachment any further. But that is not what is happening. We have also seen that some of the forest reserves like Odan Forest Reserve, Upper Warsaw, Upper Pramount Forest, these are forest reserves that you see every day in news bulletins, continuously being raided under siege by illegal mining, and really with all these activities impacting negatively on the forest ecosystem, removing a lot of the forest cover and exposing these forest reserves to practically not becoming ecologically, I would say, sustainable anymore. We have seen the Birim River, for example, also at Chebi, register very high quality index of 15, classifying it as grossly polluted, while the Pra River system's languages is in very poor quality. Now, a lot of our river systems, the Bonsa, you talk about also the Takwa areas, you know about the Kwenyaku, the water, the Yensu that supplies central region and all of that. All of these rivers have come under very serious pressure because illegal mining is very rife and continues to go on there unabated. We also saw how the LI 246 plot for mining became a big issue for all of us. But the government did actually take some steps to deal with that. Now, why is that LI very important? Because for a long time, Ghana's forest and wildlife policy had indicated that by 2035, Ghana will have completely excluded all mining from our forest reserves. So to really make sure that in 2025, with a new government, getting rid of any unfavorable and retrogressive laws was really key. But this is where we see that the government came into power, started taking steps to address it. Of course, there were some early feet dragging. We saw an amendment process that went on, and then later, much more towards the end of last year, the government taking steps to eventually revoke the airline. Now, there are still some serious issues. We have forest reserve, more than 5,500 hectares degraded, And if you look at analysis by experts in the field, they look at the cancer risks associated with the unsafe levels of the water that we are drinking, and also the heavy metal contamination in our soils, which is producing the food for us, is really, really so high that if you don't take steps as a nation, we really stand to lose a lot. And you also recall, Pure Earth and EPA did some studies on the quality of our soils, the quality of our water, and the results are very staggering. You see Konongo Oduma say, you talk about issues of higher levels of, I'll say, heavy metals like lead. And then you also talk about children in mining communities being exposed to significant risks. And the sad thing is that it's not only our water bodies, not only our forest reserve, there is a broader physical impact. For example, cocoa sector was significantly impacted, and this has not stopped. And I was discussing this today with someone that, look, I'm really curious and wondering why there's a lot of focus on discussing the reduction in cocoa prices, the most destructive, I would say, impact to the cocoa sector, and nobody is as angry as we are about the falling prices of cocoa, which is sad. So it means that we really need to do a lot, and research by the Water Research Institution shows that Ghana still stands as a risk of having water crisis by 2030 if we don't take steps to address that. Now, government has taken some steps. I need to acknowledge that. And I think for most of you here, you know that one of the very significant steps was the revocation of LI 2462. And we actually see it as one of the most progressive reversal cases that I saw the nation rally behind. So almost everybody. And then we have also seen, as Dr. Hassan talked about, we've seen 9 months on the ground. It was launched in 2022. Was supposed to be a team on the ground, boots on the ground, to really make sure that they suppress and dismantle every actions of Galamsey. But this is still something that needs to be really assessed. And all 9 red zones forest reserves have been recovered, which is good news for forest reserves like Afao Hills, Tano Anwea, Office Shelter Bed, and also Asananyo. All of these forest reserves have now been recovered. Government also have initiated certain steps, as we know, to review some of the mining concessions that were given out between 2020 and 2024. And this, for us, we think that, as you know, most of them were given out because they were politically motivated. They were given to people with fraternity, within the previous government fraternity. So there was a need to really review them. And we also know about the 400 security personnel that have been trained. These are all members of NIMOS who are supposed to be on the ground and supposed to ensure that mining in forest reserves, mining in rivers are all a thing of the past. I must say the government are all a thing of the past. I must say the government did come out to say that now our forest reserves and our rivers remain red zones. As to whether this is really the fact on the ground is another matter for another day. Now, there are still some critical gaps, less than 1,400. We have not seen it correspond with significant prosecution, much doing less than 4%. The government had talked about setting up some fast-track courts. This is still, he did indicate that maybe within 6 months this should have been up, but so far we've not seen anything yet. I hope by now Cabinet is busy really maybe reviewing those documents. We have still not seen significant implementation of Act 995 that talks about the government going about the financiers of Galamsey. We are still very much busy on the ground chasing those people who are just trying to make a living and who are falling victim of a system that is not being regulated. But the financiers are still getting away with it. And then enforcement also, we've seen that when it comes to the law enforcement agencies, there seems to be some level of complicity. Because what one cannot understand is why for every district there is a police command, and yet still Galamsey goes on as though it's a normal, legitimate business. And what we have come to see, if you go to most places where Galamsey is happening, community members can count more police officers going to the ground to visit Galamsey people as friends, not as people who are going to enforce the law, which is very, very sad. And this is where we think that if there's any action to really ensure that we deal with Galamsey, we must pay attention to the complicity of law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Then the recent, I would say, expose Tax for Galamsey, which I must say is not new, has been a very systematic issue within the natural resource sector. Because if you go to places in Ghana where they exploit charcoal, for example, assemblies take fees for charcoal production, be it illegal or legal, they take fees. If you come to areas where there's lumbering of timber and all of that, assemblies take fees. But this is one particular case that I've come to show you that, look, no matter what the central government will say, if the local government is not supporting with commensurate progressive actions, we are just going to waste our time. And I'm very happy this expose has come to show us what really happens in our district assemblies when we make the law sitting here in Accra thinking it will automatically spill over and things will change. Then we have also had CSOs also really do engage the process. They try to score in terms of actions and promises of the government to commence certain processes as part of ensuring policy stability and also sustaining the environment, which, I mean, we rate the government to have done well in terms of commencement, but we are yet to really see whether these actions, for example, the permitting for excavators, the prosecution of foreigners and all of that, whether it is really yielding the necessary result. The government has also started some restoration activities, rehabilitation. You hear recently about partnership with companies like Newmont and all those institutions. But the question is this sufficient enough to cover all those areas that have been destroyed? We don't even have a national data or information of the entire area that has been affected by Galamsey and need rehabilitation. Then, of course, we know that even though LI 2462 has been revoked, our forest reserves still remain at risk. Because as we speak here right now, there are certain miners actively removing the soils and destroying trees in a lot of our forest reserves. Now, in terms of legislative and enforcement recommendations, we really think that the president did recommend, actually promise, to make certain amendments to the Minerals and Mining Act 703. And one is to make sure that it explicitly ensures that no mining is again allowed in our forest reserve. This definitely must be done. We also need our dedicated court for environmental crimes, Galamsey and all of that. We really need to look at that. And one particular challenge we have seen when it comes to dealing with Galamsey is the absence of intelligence-backed enforcement. You've realized that when it comes to Galamsey, the police, the intelligence agencies can't seem to coordinate. Because how do you have police, military men go to the ground and you still see Galamsey operators still manage to get away? That means that they are not coordinating. And if you really want to do this, you really make sure that you deploy your intelligence service, not only for your men on the ground, but also your intelligence service to ensure that all those who are financing Galamsey, you go after. This is where all our systems of enforcement is failing. Then again, I think that we also need to revoke all politically motivated mining permits. And it's not only for those in the past. Already we are seeing some level of political interest and interference. If you go to most areas, hotspots where Galamsey is happening, they can tell you that constituency chairpersons are actually now the agents who are leading some of these Galamsey fights. After the transition, I mean, you heard Dr. Asante talk about the government's going through a transition, MPP and DC go through a transition. I must say that Galamsey also went through a transition. The MPP actor, politically exposed person's complicity in promoting Galamsey is going to be really a tough fight. Now, I think that we've set up NIMOS, but the way NIMOS is operating, insufficient funds, there's no way they're going to be able to do the job that they are supposed to do. What we know from the strategy they set up is to ensure that they were going to deploy permanently to about 21 locations in 7 hotspot regions. That has not happened. What we are seeing is sporadic raids here and there, and that is not yielding result. They go to, say, Jemira Forest in Ashanti region, they come back to Accra. The people just wait by the windows and all of that. Watch, once you get to Accra, you don't even get to Accra, they go back to the forest. They are seizing equipment, but where are the equipment going? Who is working with these equipment? So these are all issues that we need to look at. Now, I think that even if there's some sort of prosecution going on, we are not seeing the penalties becoming deterrent enough because these miners, they are rich. And we are not making sure that the penalties are deterrent enough. So they always go back. One thing that we have also seen here is that we need to put in place very deterrent measures. But to have policies where, for example, Act 995 says that if you're a foreigner and you're arrested, you need to be prosecuted. Now the government comes out with a policy that says that, oh, for foreigners, we have an arrangement with our development partners, so we'll let them go. And then you jail your own people. Then again, we also see the government or some of the state institutions looking at trying to really put in place deterrent measures by banning excavators. The government comes forward and say, let's repurpose excavators. And what is really happening is that when they confiscate the excavators, it really gets somewhere and eventually it gets lost. So there's really no deterrent measure in place. Whatever can work, we find a way to water it down. Now, there's a need also to look at really seeing galamsey as an existential threat, an issue of public health, because it's not only our water and our food, but also our health. Our health is informed by what we eat and what we drink. And with all the pollution with associated heavy metals, mercury, lead, and cadmium, we definitely have a long way to go if we are going to guarantee wholesome water, wholesome food for our citizens. Then we also want to see some very strategic action on the Ghana Water Company to try and help the citizens by publishing monthly water quality data for all our water sources. And when I say water sources, I mean all the abstraction point that Ghana Water is taking water from. It's very, very important. We also need to have a long-term national ecological restoration program. This is a tough one. I don't know where we are going to get the money for this. It's a tough one, but it's something we definitely must do. Then we also need to look at operationalizing some of these methods and strategies that are handy. A lot of the strategies people are coming with, they are so expensive, foreign driven, and there's no way I think that these things will last. And there's something that we need to look at. Cocoa Board definitely has a lot of work to do. A lot of our cocoa growing areas have lost significant cocoa. We need to look at really helping farmers to get back on their feet. And we really need to resolve some of the challenges we face now, because if the prices are going to stay low like we have seen, it means that people will now have some excuse why they should give their lands out for galamsey. So that definitely needs to be addressed. There is also the angle of traceability, and we're making sure that Ghana's gold is very legit and really satisfying all domestic and international legal requirement. If you don't do that, eventually, all the gold Ghana claims we are really producing is going to really somehow be rejected by the international community as well. We need to strengthen Ghana Gold Board. It's doing some wonderful work, but I think that we also need to have clear insight into the commercial deals of Gold Board so that we can actively engage the process. If there were losses, how did these losses come about? Why are you giving small-scale miners illegal gold premiums? Why is this even happening? So these are things that we need to really deal with. And then there are certain countries that are really fueling and supporting our galamsey. Means that we need to engage effectively, like the Chinese and all others. And we know that it's only the Chinese who are in the system. We also have our brothers from the sub-region who are also actively working here in Ghana. Togo, Togolese, we have Burkinabes. All of these people are now in our mining site. So to conclude, I think that the government has done well, but there are still critical, I'll say, underlying challenges that need to be addressed. Political capture, also the issue of complicity of law enforcement agencies are issues that we need to address. I want to end here and say that if this fight can be done, yes, I like the narrative of we all can contribute to it, but the onus lies with the leadership of government. They have the power to determine where resources flow and where allocations are made and how enforcement can actually happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have Professor Achu Amegashi online. Prof?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So should I start? Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation, CDD. And so far, I've enjoyed the presentations. Now, my original job was to be a discussant of the paper by Professor Nsedu of University of Cape Coast. But I've been asked to do both, to talk about his paper and also. So this was the last minute job I've been given. So if I don't do a good job, please forgive me. So I don't have any things to project. But okay, Professor Nsedu's article or paper is entitled An Analytical Review of the Economic Performance of the Mahama-led Administration in 2025, Achievements and Failures. So let's start with, so the period that he's generally looking at is from January 2025 to December 2025. That's of course the first year of Mahama's administration. So here are the positives that he notes, and then he has some negatives. That fuel prices reduced by between 4% and 8%. Food inflation also fell from about 28.3% at the beginning of the year to 4.9%. The cost of imported materials like medicines and raw materials stabilized because of the stability of the cedi. Taxes like e-levy, betting, and emission taxes were abolished. The debt to GDP ratio fell from 61.8% to 45%. This was largely due to the external debt restructuring. There was strict fiscal discipline, which is to say that the government is spending responsibly. They quoted a figure from the Ghana Statistical Service, which found that between January 2025 and September 2025, okay, good for projecting the slides, 330,000 people found jobs. And then there was the fall in the interest rate, particularly they mentioned the fall in treasury bill rates from 30% to 11%. So those are the things that they said Mahama's administration has done very well in its first year. Now to the bad stuff, to the negative stuff, or the weaknesses or the failures, as they call them. The revenue to GDP ratio was 16.1%, lower than Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. That means that out of our GDP, 16.1% of our GDP goes as tax revenue to the government. The debt situation, although the debt GDP ratio has fallen significantly, they note that in 2026 alone, government has to pay 20 billion to service the debt. That would be interest payments and any principal that matures. And then in 2027, government has to pay 50.3 billion to service the debt. So that will be challenging. They noted that although some jobs have been created, the unemployment rate is still high. And the employment situation in Ghana is characterized by poor quality of jobs, with over 67% in the informal sector. They also mentioned Galamsey, and that although they acknowledge that the gold board has increased, has led the production of gold up to 103 tons, and for a long time has outperformed the large-scale mining sector, that the small scale and artisanal gold miners have outperformed the large-scale mining sector. Some of the gold is definitely, they believe, is Galamsey gold. So on the whole, they give the government a passing mark. Okay, so that's their paper. My presentation is probably going to be short so that people can also chime in. Okay, the first thing that I know, I like the paper. It's a good paper. And in my comments, on my written comments, I said, it is balanced in terms of how it looks at the strengths and weaknesses of the economy from a standpoint of President Mahama's performance. Now, one thing I note is one of my pet peeves. This idea of using debt to GDP ratio, I think as a country, we have to stop doing that. The debt to GDP ratio is a very misleading measure. And the first thing you have to note is we don't pay or service debt from GDP. We service debt from revenue, not from GDP. Therefore, we should be looking at a measure like debt service or interest payments as a proportion of revenue. And if you look at Ghana's measure now, it's about 25%, which is high. That is, every revenue the government gets, at least 25% goes to servicing the debt. That means that there's only maybe less than 75% left to pay for education and other important stuff. Okay, so the debt to GDP ratio, I mean, the developed country, the high-income countries like Germany and US can do that. And the reason they can do that is because there's a tight correlation between their revenue and their GDP. Okay? So when their GDP increases by 10%, their revenue also increases by more, at least by roughly 10%. That's not the case in Ghana because our tax system is not efficient as theirs. Number one. Number two, the reason why you have to focus on revenue, not GDP, is because now Professor Nsedu says our debt to GDP ratio, our revenue to GDP ratio is 16%. Now, if your revenue to GDP ratio is 16%, it means that when your GDP increases by 1 billion, you're going to bring in about 160 million in revenue. Now, the OECD average, the Abrochire people's average, is 33%. So when their GDP increases by 1 billion, they bring in $330 million. They bring it twice. So we should focus on the we don't do that. If you go to the Ministry of Finance and look at their debt reports, they don't focus on debt service as a proportion, as a percentage of revenue. They do debt GDP. And you know, one other thing too is that there's something, you don't have to pay off all your debt in the same year. So why are you using debt to GDP? Debt is what is called a stock measure. It is something that you value at the time, the cumulative amount. Whereas GDP is a flow measure. It is per year. Comparing a stock variable to a slow variable doesn't make sense. But interest payments is something that happens every year. Revenue happens every year. So interest payment as a proportion of revenue is comparing a flow variable to a flow variable. So anytime we're looking at debt to GDP ratio, let's look at the interest payments, the debt burden, the interest payment as a proportion of revenue. And we see that doesn't look good. And I've looked at debt sustainability reports by the IMF, where when they use the debt to GDP ratio, before we defaulted on our debts, the debt to GDP ratio was saying, oh, we're not at risk. But when they use the other measures, like external debt service as a proportion of export revenue, or debt service as a proportion of revenue in general, the thresholds were breached, which means that we were at risk. So they give you different things. Okay, now let me move on to spoken about jobs, job sustainability. Now let me say something about job creation. And what I pointed out was that if you look at Japan, the percentage of people employed in the public sector is less than 10%. Germany, about 11%. US, 13%. Canada, 21%. Singapore, 9.53%. South Africa, 17.72%. Now, I bring up these numbers to show that the public sector is not the engine of job creation. There's so much the public sector can do. The public sector cannot generate enough jobs. It's still the private sector. Any place that you go, it's the private sector that is the creation that creates jobs. So if we're worried about creating jobs, then we have to empower the private sector, reduce their cost of doing business. Now, I want to say something that happens all the time. We are good at, macro figures. Inflation has fallen. GDP is growing. All sorts of things. Those things are nice, right? There's something in economics called jobless growth or growth without development. You can grow and not create jobs. You can grow and not develop. And by development, we mean like teacher student ratio, doctor patient ratios. Things that people care about, bread and butter issues. So for example, that's why when we do macroeconomic analysis, we talk about the broad macro issue, inflation, exchange rate, and other stuff. But then things like, let's say, education, healthcare, and stuff, we don't really focus on them. But those things are equally important. So, for example, the gentleman who, sorry, I think it's called Burial. Yeah, that was a good presentation. He mentioned Galamsey. Now, you see that the whole economy has to work well. That is why we find it difficult for these nice macro indicators to translate into the lives of the people. Why? The whole economy has to work well. So now he pointed out that what's happening in Galamsey is affecting the output in cocoa. So from there, it's going to affect the exchange rate. It's going to affect revenue. It's going to affect employment. So we have to. So our capacity, our inability to do some of these things, is what makes it difficult for us to move from this nice macro performance indicators to the real stuff. I'm not saying that the macro indicators are not important, but there's a stage you have to move from. So I want to quote from something that Professor Kwesi Prempeh, who's of course the director of CDD, posted on his Facebook page on February 11th, 2026. And this has to do with the debate now about cocoa, the cocoa prices, and MPP did this, and NDC did this, and blah, blah, blah. This is what Professor Prempeh said. He said, "You have been in this cocoa business since Second World War, because the cocoa board, nature of the business, price volatility and all. You know how critical this business is to you as a country and government. By now, you should be a global leader and expert in how not to manage and ride the boom and bust cycles associated with this industry. And your cocoa board should be a Harvard Business School level case study, just like Ethiopian Airlines, in what makes a well-managed state enterprise. But you are none of that. Instead, every downturn in international price throws you and your cocoa business into a fiscal tailspin. You are not learning or thinking, exclamation mark." Okay, so we're able to do some of these things, especially when we're on an IMF program, and that's commendable. But we have nice macro indicators. But for example, you hear that teachers and nurses have not been paid. Now, I'm not talking about them going on strike and asking for better pay. I'm talking about salary arrears. The salary that they've been promised, they've not been paid, right? So this shows a fundamental weakness in how we do our things and organize ourselves as a people. We produce a lot of food, but we have post-harvest losses. Some of them maybe for corn, tomatoes, yam. Some of them are as high as 30%, 20%. That means we produce the food, but because of lack of warehousing facilities, poor roads, and all that, we lose about 20 to 30% of the food that we have actually produced, right? So these are structural weaknesses in an economy. That is why we hear the stories, macro indicators are doing well, we've grown 5% in a year, 11%, and then the next time something happens, we are in a crisis, which is what Professor Kwesi Prempeh was talking about. We don't have regular employment data, and that's something we have to do well about. This employment data we talk about in Ghana, they are quarterly or even by annual, every 6 months. That's not good enough. So let me say something else about how a society has to organize itself competently for the society to grow. Take Amazon, Amazon in the US. Amazon's revenue in 2025 was more than $700 billion. That's almost $1 trillion. Amazon is a business that's to a large extent based on anonymity. It's online. Now, if you don't have a country where the laws work, there's contract enforcement, Amazon cannot thrive. So you ask yourself, online business like Tonatone and whatever, is it Junior or something in Ghana? What is their growth? So when you have an economy where the judiciary is not efficient and all these things, you can't thrive. You have all these nice macro figures, but you can't get to the next level. And that seems to be our challenge. Now, take something like treasury bill rates. Anytime now, so like Professor Nsedu says, treasury bill rates are falling from 30% to 11%. Now, treasury bill rates is the rate at which the government of Ghana borrows. Now, given that the treasury bill rates have fallen, what is the rate at which the private people in the private sector are borrowing? What are the lending rates in the commercial banks? We have to know that. Right, so treasury bills rates falling alone because there's something in economics. There's something called monetary transmission mechanism. That is, if the central bank, like Bank of Ghana in our case, reduces its policy rate, how does it flow into the economy? How does it affect other interest rates in the economy? In the countries that are well organized, a little better organized than us, the monetary policy mechanism is very efficient, right? People start refinancing their loans, mortgages. This doesn't seem to happen in Ghana. And so it all depends on the kind of structures we have that makes things difficult. Like we want business to create jobs, but they still have to deal with doom. So I know some friends who live around Teshi, Tema, and I also live around Lashibi in Ghana. And there's always light off. I mean, doom is still around. So these are things that makes it difficult for us to move to the next level. So what is my main point? My main point here is that when we look at the economy, it is nice to look at debt to GDP, inflation, treasury bill rate, the standard macro variables. But we are structured in such a way that we are not able to move to the next step where we see significant improvement in socio-economic indicators, right? Access to water, access to electricity, cost of living, these basic things still are people paid on time, because you live in a country where healthcare and teachers and education is so important, yet you have a situation where teachers and nurses are not paid on time, or there are people who have finished nursing school and they can't find jobs, yet there's a need in the healthcare sector. Yeah, it's because the government doesn't have the money to do this stuff. And why isn't the government having the money? Or why doesn't the government have the money? So all this has to do with your tax administration and all that. Let me say one last thing. This was something I was going to say. Okay, I have a friend who owns a bakery in Ghana. Now, apparently, so I'll do that immediately. I'll do that. So this person has owns a bread business. There is VAT on bread, but he is registered with GRA. So he has to charge his final consumers the VAT on bread and send the money to GRA. His competitors in the informal are not registered with GRA, so they don't have to charge VAT. Therefore, it's affecting his ability to compete, because if he charges VAT, he has to increase his price. That affects his ability to expand as a business, and that affects employment. So these are some of the structural bottlenecks we have that we have to deal with. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
them go already, just with the rearrangement in the program. So hopefully in the next 40 minutes, we'll be able to hear the rest of the interventions from some of the next. Professor Jima said 20 minutes. I doubt it will be 20, but we will try because we have about four more people speaking. And so just to make sure that we keep to time, or at least try to catch up, I would like to remind all our discussants to please keep it to 10 minutes. We are happy if you can do less than 10 minutes, but please no more than that. The report will be available for all, but it's just a chance to reflect on that. And so to get us started, I would like to call on Colonel Abuaji, who is a seasoned peace and security expert, not only for Africa, Middle East, Europe, and beyond. And he's going to spend the next 10 minutes reflecting on defense and security with us. So thank you, Prof.
So I need to become a Pentecostal preacher, hold a microphone, and still talk. So I want to stand on the existing protocols and express sincere thanks and appreciation to CDD for the kind invitation. I've been asked to serve as a discussant strictly on the 1-year performance of the JDM2 administration, and nothing more, nothing less. What I think is that we are not supposed to analyze what the administration has done as if it has finished its 4-year term. Has the JDM administration sufficiently laid the foundation that we all expected based on the key thematic theme of resetting Ghana? So without much ado, I would wish to start with the Boko conflict. By 2024, the Boko conflict had deepened as a crisis, starting from 2022, when the state went to bed and allowed a rival chief to be installed. And further to that, 2023, I think October, again closed his eyes and allowed that rival chief to position himself in Boko. So by 2024, this crisis was very, very pregnant. And we saw that pregnancy immediately after the transition. So what did the government do? In June 2025, if I'm not mistaken, the government did what all states do to pacify conflicts by ordering the augmentation of the military presence, not to solve the problem, but to contain the conflict. That deployment, which I think was from about 400 to 800, allowed movement and trade to continue along the Wale Wale Boku-Bolga corridor. I think with regards to this conflict, the most decisive policy action by the government, which went beyond containment, was the engagement of the Asante and his committee to try and find a mediated outcome for the conflict. And that went on from May or April to May 2025. By April, May 2025, we heard the president tell us about a week ago that unfortunately, during the mediation period, 119 people lost their lives. I've not mentioned the July 2025 incident when the military presence destroyed some artifact which further worsened the situation. The state of the Boku conflict is that after 1 year, the conflict has not been solved, but the government has managed or succeeded to contain the conflict. Now, what concerns me a bit is the framing of the conflict as a rule of law question. The Boku crisis, anybody who understands the history, goes beyond rule of law. So we should expect the government from year 2 onwards, and we're already in year 2, to continue to find alternative mediation efforts to resolve the conflict. Because the resort to the rule of law, i.e. enforcing whatever the courts have decided, can only go on for about 8 more years. At any time the government changes, we can be sure that there is going to be a deepening of the crisis. Then I'll move quickly to 2 interrelated incidents within the defense and security sector. I think by the end of 2024, the approximately 14,000 strong Ghana Armed Forces had remained professional and had remained disciplined, but materially overstretched. If we go back to the Global Firepower Index, the Ghana Armed Forces of Ghana was rated, where is the figure? 110 out of 145 countries. It means that we are not ranking very well. The Ministry of Defense was in debt, i.e. the government inherited a debt from the previous administration, and I'm told it's about 343.9 million. And then the defense budget had declined from 349 million to 317 million, meaning that in the immediate period before the government came to power, the situation of the Ghana Armed Forces was not encouraging. Yet the armed forces have succeeded to sustain their peacekeeping deployments, prioritizing internal security deployments, especially on the northern borders of the country, but modernizing the Ghana Armed Forces has been slow and has fallen behind expected timelines. So that was when the August 6th helicopter crash occurred. I think we've spoken a lot about it. There weren't enough helicopters, and this only one that was serviceable, the Z9, was not meant to fly in the kind of weather that pertained on the 6th of August. Now, what was the problem? Which I think the investigation committee did not address itself. Apart from the shortage of equipment, the real problem that caused the accident was a subculture. The president must go. In other words, the political class over the years have managed to overrule professional advice to say that we think, given A, B, C, D, we probably should not do X, Y, Z. That Z9 should not have flown. And I think you've heard anecdotes to that effect. But it was imperative on the Ghana Armed Forces or the Ghana Air Force to fly the team. And then in the process, we lost the 8 lives. Then we ran to, when was it? A few weeks ago, when another 6 young lives, female lives, were lost during the recruitment. And many of us have tended, of course, including myself, to think that the armed forces didn't do well because all they had to do, among other things, was to control, to manage the large numbers of people who were coming to go through the process. But that is not the problem. The problem which is buried underneath is the youth unemployment. That all of a sudden, you have about 30,000 people wanting to join the Ghana Armed Forces. It's beyond the Ghana Armed Forces, I think, in that context. But it is associated. And I think going forward, the government has put in place a few immediate remedial measures to manage the recruitment process. But going forward, we need this to be codified, to be entrenched as a practice, so that we don't end up with this happening. Of course, the associated problem is what I call the state capture. The politicization of recruitment, where up to 2024, it was openly said in Parliament that slots had been allocated to MPs. That is a serious, Honorable, I have not, I hope I have not touched the raw nerve. I mean, it has serious security implications. So what the government has inherited currently is a Ghana Armed Forces, which is NDC, and which is MPP. MPP Ghana Army and NDC Ghana Army. Now, that is not a democratic armed forces. And I think some of the measures the government has embarked upon, the e-recruitment and all manner of things, would help to make sure that recruitment is democratized. I will jump over, I think I've gone beyond Galamsey, so I haven't reached Galamsey. A few weeks ago, we heard about an amnesty. That was a very bold step, very bold initiative to try and mop up the illegal arms circulating within our society. And many sectors of the society have been victims of that, including the Boko conflict. But you see, I was concerned that the amnesty was based on a database that was already outdated. By 2004, Kofi Annan conducted a baseline study and found 240 guns in circulation in Ghana. 10 years later, by 2014, the same Kofi Annan conducted another survey and established that there were 2.3 million weapons, and 1.1 million were unregistered. And out of the registered ones, the 1.3, about 100,000 of them were not licenses that were renewed. So I expected The amnesty, you are being unduly harsh on us. Anyway, the amnesty was a good step. It was well intended, but it must be seen as a foundational. And we need now to go back and do a more comprehensive amnesty. I will not fight with the MC, so I will quickly go to the concluding part of my presentation. And I think, as was said, the presentation itself will be available for those who will be interested in obtaining copies. Excuse me. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, my conclusion is that Ghana did not break up in 2025. The constitutional order largely held. The government took real action, or has taken real action on Galamsey, and I think we saw elements of that in Darius' presentation. It deployed or augmented forces for Boku and responded to other tragedies with accountability. But I think that there's a difference between managing crises as they arrive and building institutions to prevent the crisis from happening. The question we need to ask ourselves is, has the government during the 1 year laid sufficient foundational elements that will help it to build upon the security, defense, and the peace building architecture of the country? I wish to recall that, as has been said, the threats that we are facing are not standing still. They are evolving. And I think if the reset is to mean anything, it must move from deployment to redesign. A defense modernization audit, that is, it must include a defense modernization audit, a national disarmament strategy, a digital recruitment reform, a Boku peace architecture beyond the escorts currently prevailing, constitutional safeguards in cyber legislation that Dr. Pumpuni mentioned. The one thing that I didn't have the opportunity to talk about is that by the time this government is leaving office, that National Security Coordinator's outfit must be reverted to its constitutional mandate. I've just received an email or a message that the government is going to change the name. The NIB was not established as another force. It was established to coordinate policies, including intelligence. So even if this government came and met a security coordinator's outfit, that is, running around in Gestapo style, arresting and detaining people, as part of the reset agenda, the government must make sure that the national coordinator's outfit becomes a truly, purely civilian organization. And let the NIB, which I'm told is about to revert to BNI, become the law enforcement arm of the government together with the Ghana Police Service. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Colonel Gwaji. Next up, we are going to invite a discussant to reflect on the theme of anti-corruption and accountability. Before I introduce her, I just want to remind everyone, especially those joining us online, if you have questions, please put it in the chat box, or you can tweet at us at all the online channels that were mentioned earlier, and we have people monitoring those platforms, so they'll take all those questions, including those in the other conference room as well. We also will have some of our CDD colleagues there to take your questions, so we have not forgotten about you. So next up, we have Mrs. Beauty Nate, who is going to, who is Executive Secretary of the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition, and she's going to reflect briefly on anti-corruption.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. So I will be as brief as the moderator has indicated. And so I'm reflecting on the anti-corruption and accountability paper. I must say that it's a well-written, balanced assessment of the Mahama's one-year administration in terms of issues of anti-corruption. It's well structured and written in simple English. And I was excited with that because we need to communicate issues of anti-corruption in a very simplified way, especially to the younger folks. So the authors have done well to do that. I also agree with the authors that Ghana's anti-corruption system remains far too dependent on political benevolence rather than strong, independent, and well-resourced institutions. I equally agree with them that the documented positive highlights of the Mahama first-year administration, especially when situated within the context of where the previous administration left in the fight against corruption, it's something that we commend. But there again, the authors also were deeply reflective of the signals of the administration. And in doing that, they commended the Mahama administration for all the positive signals, which Dr. Asante already highlighted, so I wouldn't go through them. But the question is, signals are not systems. Signals are good, but we have to take the next step of institutionalizing and building systems that will help us in the fight against corruption. Sorry. So in saying that, I wanted to find out all the signals that were highlighted. Would want to see how this is a reset of the anti-corruption agenda, particularly the issue of post-regime accountability. And that is one of the issues that the authors reflected on, given that the signaling of aggressive pursuits of previous regime at the disadvantage of a selective justice to people who are aligned to the current party. And that is a question that we need to ask. Have we reset the post-regime accountability to a truly regime accountability? And we also need to understand or reflect deeply in terms of the reduction of the numbers, especially of political appointees, which the authors also reflected on. How does that impact directly on corruption fight? I think that is a gap that we need to address in the paper. And we also need the numbers, because we continue to look at how we are losing so much in corruption. So if indeed we are saying that the Mahama administration's first year looks good, we need to see data regarding numbers, data regarding impact, and data regarding regime accountability. I will skip some of the things because the paper will be available, but I would just want to focus on a few issues that I think. Another issue that was highlighted has to do with structural weaknesses in the perceived overlap between the OSP, Yoko Shraj, and the Attorney General. I believe that we could fully explore why these overlaps persist. We could also look at how political incentives reinforce fragmentation of roles. And Colonel Abuaji is already been drawing our attention to one in the security sector. We also need to understand what structural barriers are preventing consolidation. And there's also the perceived tension between the Office of the Special Prosecutor and the Attorney General. And the authors will help us if they reflect in terms of how this has affected an effective fight against corruption. If Honorable Oponkuma will permit me, as they say, when two elephants fight, it's the ground that suffers. Or maybe, perhaps we say, when the elephant and the umbrella fight, it's the ground that suffers. But I believe that this perceived tension appears to be what CSOs, perhaps we were prophetic in 2017 when we drew attention to the fact that we needed a constitutionally independent special prosecutor and not a special prosecutor whose mandate is borrowed and vulnerable to political interference. So the paper could help us to understand the structural risk of an OSP built on borrowed power rather than constitutional independence. The paper also highlights the misuse of false news, provisions, and shrinking civic space. These also, we need to understand how this implication, the implications on media freedom under an anti-corruption reset agenda. So that relationship should also be clearly articulated. Another major concern has to do with NACAP and the NIACAP, which the paper highlighted as a promising successor to the NACAP. We also like to reflect that is the design, the current design of the NACAP, is it structured enough to insulate the failure of NACAP, which has to do with funding? So the question to again ask is, has the Mahama administration's research agenda provided a dedicated funding for NACAP? The one that has also been a thorny one has to do with procurement and public financial management risks. The paper acknowledges this as a high corruption area, but the paper failed to help us to appreciate in terms of the commitment that was made to the IMF to integrate the GANEPs with the GIFMIS. And that is something that we need to explore. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I agree that most anti-corruption reforms in Ghana fail not because of design flaws, but because of political incentives, elite bargains, and informal power networks. But I believe that the authors were too generous in interpreting early reforms as systemic gains. And we need to sufficiently and critically assess the institutional weaknesses and political incentives that limit Ghana's anti-corruption progress. We look forward to a deeper reflection in that respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salate. So next up, I would like to invite Professor Abdul Gafaru Abdullahi. He is a professor in the Department of Public Administration at the University of Ghana Business School. And he, like all the others, will be sharing very briefly with us and reflecting on the topic of environment and social development. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. So I got 2 papers to read, to review, and I'm asked to review them in 10 minutes, which means an average of 5 minutes or less per paper. And on top of all of these, after 4 p.m. on Ramadan day 2. So what that means is that I have no choice than to be very brutally selective. Let me begin by, commending CDD and the authors for 2 very well-written reports, one focusing on issues around social protection, the social policy landscape more broadly, and the other on the issue around the environment. I like the assessments and the approach that the authors adopted, mainly because they go beyond previous efforts in doing this kind of things by assessing government's performance on the basis of the extent to which they had fulfilled manifesto promises. In this particular case, to looking at some critical gaps. In both reports, probably what I expected or hoped to see a little bit more would be a more critical interrogation of the progress that we are actually reporting, and the question of whether the progress that are being reported or witnessed is sufficient relative to the need or the realities that we have on the ground. And I'm just going to cite a few examples, first and foremost from the social protection report. So the report actually commended government, and very rightly so, for increasing public spending as far as the sector is concerned. If you take a look at the 2026 budget statement, it talked of government actually increasing public spending on Ghana's major social protection policies from 0.6% of GDP to 0.9% of GDP. If you actually juxtapose this against our recent past, you would say, yes, this is very good progress that is worth celebrating. But the International Labour Organization recommends that at our level of development, we should actually be doing 2.4% of our GDP in terms of our public spending on that particular sector, which in this respect reminds us that even though some progress has been made, we do definitely have a long way to go. And it's important that we keep reminding our governments that we need more, because what is important for us as citizens is not to celebrate little progress that are being made, but to point to existing gaps, remind governments of where we really want to be. Again, the report commends government, and again, very rightly so, for increasing the number of LEAP beneficiary households from, I think, 350,000 to 400,000. This is 50,000 households in a year. Of course, everyone would clap. But we're talking of a country where we have, according to the latest Ghana Living Standards Survey, we have an estimated, 2.8 to 3 million extremely poor people, we're not talking of the, poor people. We're talking of the extreme poor incidents. What does this mean? It implies that at the current pace of 50,000 additional households a year, by the end of this regime, the 4-year tenure of this regime, we would have been having around 550,000 households. In that context, we would still have a significantly large number of the extreme poor not actually benefiting from some of these important programs. So yes, there is some progress, and we have every reason to celebrate those progress, but we also actually need to go beyond to ask ourselves whether the rate of expansion that we are actually witnessing matches the magnitude of need that we are actually faced with at the moment. And these existing gaps also imply that we are actually still very far away from implementing social protection programs from a rights-based perspective. We just have the selected lucky ones, and there are still substantial inclusion and exclusion errors across many of the programs that are actually being implemented. You talked about the free sanitary pad program, which, again, is one of the most visible social development initiatives that this government had actually launched, implemented in 2025 and continuing till date, with some 292 million Ghana cedis allocated for the program in both 2025 and 2026, which again is something that, of course, we must comment. But where are we as far as issues of implementation is concerned? What are the existing gaps? Sometime late last year, Send Ghana and its partners commissioned the University of Ghana to do a rapid assessment of implementation of this program so far. The findings pointed to very substantial gains that have actually already been recorded, including reduced menstruation-related absenteeism, improvement in class participations by school people, and so on and so forth. But the observations also pointed to significant gaps that we need to be paying a lot more attention to as well. The exclusion errors that I mentioned earlier is something that this program, so across the 6 districts where data was collected and analyzed for this study, we found in almost every district school children receiving sanitary pads, but who have actually not yet started menstruating. In other words, they take the pads, they give to their aunties, they give to their sisters, they give to their mothers. And this is a program that is actually meant to reduce absenteeism. And we're not talking of a program that is universal or that has been, if there is excess, and everyone else gets, that's fine. But in a case where you are still targeting, we're talking of 6 million, out of several millions of people who deserve or need to gain access to these. So we still have some way to go as far as the implementation gaps of many of these programs are concerned. Let me just make a few remarks on the issue of the environment paper, which I find very rich. It's full of data. Any policymaker who reads that report and not moved by the figures, I don't know what else would actually move you. It has very rich data that I think would be very useful in influencing policy decisions in this case. But I'm a political economist by training. Professor Jimabodi is here. He trained me, so when I speak, he understands my language, and I try to understand many of these things from a political angle. My main concern, maybe about the general frame, even though the paper highlighted some of these issues, bits and pieces across the report. My main position about Galamsey is that until we understand and recognize and acknowledge that the Galamsey problem is a political problem, and that the Galamsey problem requires political solutions, most of these things that we are doing are actually going to yield only very suboptimal results. we need to tackle the political drivers of Galamsey head on. I mean, Ghana, as we know, and we all know, operates in a certain political environment where, I mean, we're talking of two dominant parties, very slim electoral margins, high campaign costs, patronage distributing networks, and we are all aware. I mean, CDD did a study, I think, sometime in 2018, and I did a more recent study in that, trying to look at the relationship between party financing and Galamsey. We have a situation where Galamsey rents finance political campaigns, and campaign financing sustains the competitive clientelist nature of our electoral politics. And this environment also sustains informal rent distribution, and the informal rent distribution in turn sustains Galamsey. So there's a certain cyclical political problem that needs to be broken somewhere. I mean, the report highlighted a number of points that it regarded as progress, but it's also important that we ask ourselves, I mean, to what extent should we celebrate this progress? For example, it talks of over 1,400 people being arrested, 450 excavators being seized, 9 forest reserves repossessed. My question or concern is that historically we know that the military crackdowns that we have experienced in the past have honestly not eliminated Galamsey. They have, and I've argued elsewhere, that the most significant benefit or impact of the military operations against Galamsey is that they often succeed in changing the redistribution associated with Galamsey. In other words, it provides opportunities for rent distributions to change from one political group to the other. That's all that we gain by sending these military people to the ground. So if you look at many of, and many of the things that we are observing are very familiar patterns. I mean, we've had Operation Flash Out going back to 2006. We witnessed recently the various military operations that were launched by, Vanguard, and so on. So we usually would have a situation where enforcement efforts would intensify at the beginning. When political costs in mind, then we see evidence of political costs in mining communities or constituencies rising. Then opposition would mobilize miners against the government in power. Then enforcement would soften as we get closer to elections. Then the networks around Galamsey get reconstituted. So at the end of the day, we have a situation where the redistribution associated with the current approaches to fighting Galamsey only gets changed from one political regime to the other. So my main comment or concern about the way we think about Galamsey is that, yes, we have made some progress in terms of deploying the military, making arrests, seizing equipments, and so on and so forth. I mean, the report highlights the fact that even in terms of the enforcement, we are having a situation where the attention so far has largely been on excavators and not the financiers. I mean, the financiers who are actually behind many of these practices, we are yet to see significant evidence of they being tackled in a way that would help address the root causes of the problem. In brief, my argument or concern is that the progress that we are seeing are yet to substantially target the political drivers of the problem, and in assessing progress made, we should ask ourselves whether the progress that we are seeing are tackling the symptoms of the problem, or whether we are actually doing enough in tackling the root causes or the key drivers of the factors that actually drive Galamsey. My final question to the team is, I do understand why a report on the environment would focus on Galamsey, but I was wondering, one of the questions I noted down when I was reading the report was, we're now in an era of climate change, and our environmental crisis actually go beyond the degradation of our lands. This regime, for example, reconfigured and reconstituted the Ministry of Energy and now calling it Ministry of Energy and Green Transition. What do those initiatives actually mean in terms of real commitment to tackle the environmental problems in our society? I'm told it is time, and I've finished.
Thank you very much. So very briefly, I've just been told that we are going to allow Honorable Member of Parliament, Kojo Oppong-Nkrumah, to give brief remarks. As a man who is seasoned in a lot of things, and especially radio, I have every confidence that he will do it very briefly in 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
I refuse the temptation to be brief. Let me say good evening to you. First, I'm making these remarks on behalf of the minority leader. As you saw, we came with a whole delegation, but there's a lot of business on the floor that is just being called, so he's had to take the lead, and now we are being called to the House. So just a few remarks. It's, first of all, heartwarming that platforms like this are being put together to begin the exercise of examining what the government has been delivering vis-a-vis the challenge and opportunity and the promises that have been made. And it is our hope and our expectation that this is not just going to be a one-off, but what it does is that it sets out the parameters for regular assessment of the performance of government going forward. Our remarks are in just two forms. First on the economy, and second on a few selected items. And the matters of the economy, we'll pick from some of what the earlier speakers have mentioned. Three key things that we'll probably speak to. And across these three things, our prayer, our request is that we begin to examine some things in detail. Number one, the methods that are being used. Number two, the costs of those methods, be it the real cost or the opportunity cost. And number three, the sustainability of some of those methods. And I'll speak to a few things. So take monetary policy, for example. A lot of people applaud today that we have currency stability. And you would recall that the minority caucus, right from, I think, the first quarter of 2025, started calling out the method being used, that it depended on heavy market intervention, and that the real structure of the Ghanaian economy had not been tackled in any way. At that time, we were heavily rebuffed. As time has gone on, it has now become evident that in the year 2025 alone, nothing less than about $10 billion of intervention or intermediation. We have not said intervention or intermediation is not part of the toolkit, but the extent to which it is being done now leads us to believe that we are now operating a regime where the government is pegging the currency and now trying to intervene heavily to achieve that currency peg. That raises a question of the cost. In direct terms, the costs you may find in how much of our international reserves is being made available for this intervention program. You can now also ask the question about the opportunity cost, what those reserves could have been used for, if not for the purposes of this direct intervention with the objective of achieving a currency peg of 10. You can then also ask yourself the other question of the environmental costs as have been raised. Now that it is becoming clear that part of this model is most likely absorbing into the value chain gold from illegal or irresponsible small-scale mining. So the method matters, the cost matters, and now you come to the question of sustainability. Now we are being told that about half of our gold reserves have been sold and converted into forex. And we have very, very, very deep fears that part of that forex now comes back into the intermediation. And therefore, what is beginning to happen, we fear, is a depletion of reserves for the purposes of intermediation to achieve a currency peg. The methods matter, the cost matter, how sustainable is it? So it's not just about looking at the headline number and saying it is static at 10, But what are the methods? What are the costs? What's the sustainability? Take inflation, for example. One of the major methods that is being used is the sterilization approach, which is currently being used. And at times when we have raised it again, we've been rebuffed heavily. The government admits it on page 284 of their 2026 budget. Over 60 billion Ghana cedis worth of sterilization. The cost of that, first of all, you will find in nominal terms in the Bank of Ghana's books, because it's not zero. It costs the Bank of Ghana a lot of money to sterilize. But you also find it on the streets when people are telling you that liquidity in town is gone down and how it therefore affects general demand levels. So on monetary policy, for example, methods, cost, sustainability, these are things that we are hoping civil society experts will begin to also look at, not just the headline numbers. Take the fiscals, for example. There's a lot of talk about consolidation and discipline. But if you go into the details, you will find out that while this administration inherited 16% revenue to GDP ratio, the revenue measures that they've introduced, as at the end of Q3 last year, had dwindled our revenue effort to 11% of GDP. That's about 5% of GDP lost. We're hoping to see the end year figures. But you want to examine these figures some more, not just a headline number of fiscal discipline, for example. And that's why we believe, for example, they are having a lot of expenditure constraints. So now when you hear people of 11 months salary arrears, you hear things that cannot be paid for. If you delve into the numbers and trace it, you will be able to answer the questions of methods, cost, and sustainability. Look at the rail sector, for example. The key flagship programs of government, the 24-hour economy. And I think today the president has assented to the bill. We have been loud in making the point that the bill departs totally from the promise. In fact, now is an act. The act departs totally from the promise. And what has been done is just to establish an authority. But that authority, respectfully, we are of the view, will not deliver the 24-hour work cycle or the shift system that they are looking for. Again, we encourage an examination of the detail, not just the headline that the bill has been now assented to, and therefore it has been achieved. Some of the key economic programs, the National Apprenticeship Program, you want to get into the detail and find out where are the supposed beneficiaries, have they come out of it, and what are they putting it to? Not just the fact that it has been launched and some money is made available for it. The National Coding Program. And currently you are seeing the challenge we're having, for example, in the cocoa sector, where, you know, farmers are now losing over 1,000 Ghana cedis per bag. On Friday, the finance minister on behalf of government has accepted to meet us in the minority caucus as we put forward some of the representations that cocoa farmers are asking for, including a rescission of that decision. And we're hoping that government will pay some more attention to it. Other things like automatic recruitment into the civil service, etc., are all now hanging in the balance. One of the key things which we heard Prof speak about is job creation. If I heard him correct, he was talking about 300,000 or so in the first year. The government says it's 1 million. That's what the technical advisor from the Ministry of Finance tells us. So which is which? And that is why we keep making the point that not just the headline, but the details that also need to be examined. And then you come to the other side of the economic equation about development. So the full value chain and transformation you are looking for, many of the major items beyond what was bequeathed, GIADEC, GISDEC, gold refinery, in the first 1 year, what more is the new thing that has been added? I want to just touch on the second part of our remarks, which deals with a few other issues. We are of the fear that we are over-relying on commodity prices once again as an economy, and that a lot of the supposed stability and improvement you are seeing is hinged on the performance of commodity prices, a lot of which has nothing to do with us. Cocoa appeared to be doing well initially until the slump, but because of the major changes in the trading structure as part of the reset, now the government is being forced to pass on the current slump in prices to the poor cocoa farmer. Contrary to the old structure where you could hedge based on the type of trading model that you pick. And we warn that we should not do same with gold. Gold prices are on a high because of uncertainty around the world. If we over-depend on the windfall and do not build the necessary buffers, we fear we may be here once again. And these are also some of the places that we are hoping that civil society, as you start these exercises of examination, will now push government towards, and not just the headline that, for example, the gold board is a good idea, it has translated into so. We are relying heavily on a shore up of gold prices, which has nothing to do with us. On the other side, take a look at oil. Oil prices came down, is translating into good prices on the market. But today, some fears are coming up looking at what's happening on the global stage with Iran, for example. Are there measures to ensure that it doesn't translate into higher oil prices on the market? And so we draw attention that civil society, as you engage in this, please take a look at that. Two final comments, one on security. Again, we are beginning to get worried that Ghanaians are being targeted in some of the terrorist-prone areas because of our recent engagements with some of the states, the nation states, in places where previously Ghanaians were not targeted. Now you'll find that the jihadists are taking a view that Ghana is in bed with their governments and are beginning to target. And these are matters that need to be deeply interrogated, not just treated on the surface as an incident that has just occurred somewhere. And then I would end with Colonel Festus Abuaji's comment on the Security and Intelligence Services Act. The original challenge occurred in the promulgation of, or in the passage of Act 526, which, contrary to Articles 83, 84, 85, did not spell out proper legislation for the BNI, for example. It just recognized what used to be called the special branch. And in our day, we passed Act 1030, seeking to correct that problem, but I'm not shy to admit that we didn't do it well. The new administration now purports to want to correct it in the examples that Colonel Festus Abuaji was giving. But they're actually now worsening the problem by commingling the functions of the external intelligence agencies with the internal. So now you have an overlap. And also by attempting to create the Office of the National Security as a security agency on its own. Those are some of the things that hopefully this afternoon in Parliament we'll be trying to turn around. So we commend CDD for starting this exercise of 1 year on. We hope it's not a final. Our expectation is that there will be more of this and deeper attention will be paid to some of these issues. We thank you for the opportunity, even as we beg to take leave of you.
Thank you very much for the remarks and for a little while. So next up, I am going to invite, and he is online, Professor Stephen Kweku-Asare. He's the Democracy and Development Fellow in Public Law and Justice at CDD Ghana, and he will also be reflecting very, very briefly in 10 minutes or less. So, Professor Asare, can you hear us?
I can.
Perfect.
Should I proceed?
Yes, please, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, my brothers and sisters. I have been asked to serve as a discussant of 4 papers that assess democracy, governance, the rule of law, and human rights. My task, of course, is not to repeat the findings you've already heard, but to step back and ask a different question. What do these assessments mean when we read them together? After going through all 4 papers, and they are very, very good papers, I'm struck by one central tension. We are watching a government trying to repair trust in institutions while simultaneously testing those same institutions in the process. The assessments portray a country emerging from a period of deep institutional fatigue, a declining trust in state institutions and government systems, a democracy facing structural challenges requiring renewal, a civic space and rights protection under strain, and a local governance weakened by fiscal dependence and administrative fragmentation. These are not 4 different diagnoses. They are 4 scans of the same patient. And that patient, my brothers and sisters, is not a democracy in collapse. It is a democracy under stress, trying to recalibrate. Across the reports, I see what I call a reform paradox. Actions intended to strengthen democracy sometimes generate new anxieties about it. For example, efforts to pursue accountability for past wrongdoing are necessary, yet they risk being perceived as selective enforcement, if not even-handed. Public commitments to rights and freedoms are strong, yet incidents involving journalists and activists continue to raise concern. We are seeing some ambitious constitutional and judicial reforms meant to make our institutions stronger. But when certain processes become highly conscious, especially things like the removal of senior office holders, people naturally start to feel uneasy about whether those institutions are truly independent. Decentralization is emphasized, yet structural dependence of local authorities on the center remains unresolved. So the picture is neither success nor failure. It is transition. And transitions are always noisy, contested, and incomplete. Let me spend a few minutes on one theme that runs quietly through all 4 papers: partisanship and polarization. Each report mentions it in different ways, but taken together, they raise a deeper concern. Democracies are designed to argue. Disagreement is not the danger. The real danger is when we lose a shared space of facts. By a shared space of facts, I mean a basic agreement on what information we accept as credible, even when we disagree about what we do with that information. Low public trust in institutions already creates a fragile baseline. Human rights debates are increasingly read through lenses of selective justice and political suspicion. When accountability only comes after a regime has left office, which often happens when there was little accountability while it was in power, it can easily be seen or even twisted as political payback rather than a genuine institutional process. Contentious institutional actions, including removal processes and legislative battles, have generated partisan acrimony and legitimacy doubts. Even decentralization reforms struggle against structural distrust between the center and local actors. When every issue becomes partisan, evidence is mistrusted. Expertise is politicized. Neutral institutions are viewed with suspicion. Even good policies cannot command legitimacy. At that point, governance lows, not because we lack ideas, but because we lack trust. The question for Ghana then is not whether we disagree. There must be disagreement. We always will. The question is whether we still share enough common ground for evidence to persuade across political lines. That shared civic space is the infrastructure democracy depends on. Let me end by briefly reflecting on what a first-year assessment cannot yet tell us. A first-year assessment inevitably measures intentions and signals, not outcomes. It cannot yet measure institutionalization. We still do not know whether accountability mechanisms will become permanent norms or political tools, whether decentralization will change incentives, not just budgets, whether constitutional reform would deepen consensus or intensify polarization, and whether democratic culture is being strengthened or merely reset. Time will answer these questions, my brothers and sisters, not announcements. As one of the papers wisely notes, improving democratic quality is a systemic process that takes more than a year. Let me conclude with 3 observations. First, the first year shows motions, but motion is not the same as direction. Activity alone does not guarantee progress. We may see new policies, new structures, new initiatives, but that is not the same as moving in the right direction, just as heat is not the same as light. Second, Ghana's democratic test today is no longer about whether we can hold credible elections. We have largely mastered that. The test is whether we can govern credibly between elections. Third, the long-term success of this administration will depend less on the boldness of its reforms and more on whether those reforms make institutions more predictable, more impartial, and frankly, more boring. Because strong institutions are not dramatic, they are routine. If 3 years from now, governance feels less exciting but more trusted, then this first year would have succeeded. Thank you.
Alabo. He is an astute academic and a career diplomat with over 3 decades of experience. I'm particularly excited for him to reflect on foreign affairs and regional integration. So, Ambassador Alabo.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. Excellencies, where the honorables are gone, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by thanking CDD for inviting me to share some thoughts, reflections on the excellent paper that they have prepared for this occasion. I'm really privileged to be taking part in this roundtable. Incidentally, the paper that was presented to us had 2 co-authors, all of them very distinguished friends of mine. In fact, Ambassador Francis Chegan happens to be my senior in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I hold him in such high esteem. So what can I say about a paper written by him? His co-author happens to be my student at LESIAD, Emmanuel Yeboah. But without any prejudice to our friendship, let me say that the CDD paper was well researched and very balanced. And I read it with a lot of satisfaction. It gives us the true story or the true situation of our foreign policy, and within the period of 1 year that this administration has been in office. I'll say a few things, nothing to criticize the paper, because as I said, it was well researched and balanced, but just to share a few reflections as a former diplomat and ambassador, and also as an academic today. So I approach this assessment with both professional discipline and patriotic responsibility. Foreign policy is not an arena for partisanship. It is the long game of national interest. And the first year of this administration presents a moment to examine whether Ghana has merely re-entered the diplomatic stage or whether we are repositioning ourselves strategically within a rapidly shifting global order. As was said as was mentioned by Dr. Asante in his introductory remarks, the inauguration of President Mahama was attended by no less than 20 heads of state. So symbolically, it was very powerful. It signaled diplomatic re-engagement and reaffirmed Ghana's historic identity as a stabilizing and respected actor in the West African sub-region as well as the African continent. But symbolism alone, rather, symbolism must be matched by sustained strategy. So let's take a look at what has been done so far. I think my technology is trying to disappoint me. So, okay. Okay, here we go again. So let me look at a few areas of interest as highlighted in the paper. First of all, we see that let's start with Ghana's diplomatic re-entry. I think the administration's emphasis on good neighborliness and high-level engagements across the West African sub-region, as mentioned by Dr. Asante, reflects a deliberate attempt to restore Ghana's diplomatic centrality. However, visibility is not the same as influence. The key questions we all must be asking are as follows. Number one, how has Ghana's diplomatic activism translated into agenda-setting power within the West African sub-region or the continent as a whole? Are we shaping outcomes or reacting to crisis? Thirdly, is our diplomacy anchored in a clearly articulated long-term foreign policy doctrine? Ghana has historically been strongest when our diplomacy has combined moral authority with strategic clarity. The balance must be improved, must be preserved and improved. Now, when we come to the Sahel region, the creation of the Sahel regional platform and the timely, I should say, appointment of a special envoy represent bold institutional innovations by the Mahama administration. They signal recognition that instability in the Sahel is not distant. Excuse me. But it is even, one may say, potentially existential. The Sahel crisis is not merely about jihadist violence. It involves 4 different areas that need to be looked at. Fragile state institutions, military takeovers, and unconstitutional changes of government, expanding external geopolitical competition, and then youth disenfranchisement and climate vulnerability are all there. Now, this administration deserves credit for proactive engagement. However, effectiveness must be measured by these 3 factors. Number one, effectiveness must be seen in terms of operational coordination. Is the platform linked to intelligence sharing? Is it linked to border management systems? And is it linked to joint security frameworks? The second thing we must look at is policy coherence. Does the platform align with the sub-regional conflict prevention architecture? Personally driven? These are questions that need to be asked. But I will argue that if the platform becomes consultative rather than operational, its long-term impact may be limited. Let's look at Ghana within the ECOWAS framework. Ghana has historically played the role of moderator, mediator, I beg your pardon, peace builder, and democratic advocate in the sub-region. Yet ECOWAS, as we know, is itself undergoing a lot of strain, from internal fragmentation to questions about enforcement credibility. The Mahama administration's challenge is twofold. Number one, to help restore normative order within ECOWAS, and then to avoid overextension without adequate leverage. These are issues that I believe will be approached with all the seriousness in this second year. But let's look at the global geopolitics and how Ghana has waded into some areas. I'm not going to go into any detail, but all within the time at my disposal. But it's important to note that the global order is shifting, and shifting very quickly. There is intensified great power competition. There is also fragmentation of multilateral consensus. And then thirdly, there is increasing security, commercial diplomacy linkages. Ghana's foreign policy must therefore be economically intelligent. Our diplomacy must translate into the following. 1, trade expansion. 2, strategic infrastructure partnerships. And then 3, technology and industrial cooperation. And then lastly, diaspora investment mobilization. Let me say that diplomatic activism without economic conversion can be very risky in terms of becoming just ceremonial. But I'm happy to note that with this government, over the 1 year, we have noticed some very, very important developments as far as turning diplomatic activism into tangible progress. Let's take, for example, what I call the Fugu diplomacy. We're all witnesses to how what was meant to deride our president's excellent address turned out to become a very solid export product. Let's put it that way. We all saw how the foreign minister was able to, together with the president, they were able to put up a very spirited defense of the excellent Patakari that we have. And as a result of that, you know, it has become a sought-after product in Zambia. And we told that even many foreign ministers outside of Zambia want to be part of the new iconic dress of Fugu. I think that is good. It means in effect, you know, in trade terms, we're going to have a lot of very positive developments. Now, let me just, if you give me 2 minutes, say something about, first of all, what are the achievements, very briefly, and then what are some of the gaps that need to be attended, to be dealt with, attended to. Number one. Yeah. Quickly. Okay. Now my phone has given up, so I have to try. Fortunately, I had a backup situation, you know, so let me try quickly, and then finish with what I wanted to say. Okay. I think it should be here. Okay. Yes. So what are the gaps and risks? First of all, achievement. In its first year, the administration has reasserted Ghana's diplomatic presence and leadership in the West African sub-region, on the African continent, and in the global south. Secondly, it has elevated Sahel instability to a core foreign policy priority. Thirdly, it has demonstrated early multilateral engagement. These are important first steps. Now, what are some of the gaps? The key gaps remain. One, an absence of a consolidated foreign policy doctrine, which I agree with what the paper put out. And that foreign policy doctrine must be publicly articulated and measurable to fortify Ghana's diplomatic currency. Number two, limited clarity on measurable outcomes of the Sahel region platform has also been mentioned, and I agree with that. There's the need, thirdly, for stronger integration between foreign policy and economic strategy. And that is what I see the administration can do more. But then the fourth one, potential overstretch amid fiscal constraints. Diplomacy must be resource-backed. Underfunded diplomacy weakens credibility. What are the pathways forward? I propose 5 strategic pathways. I'll just mention them quickly, and then I'll be over. Align the Sahel platform with sub-regional conflict prevention architecture will be my proposal. Develop a Ghana foreign policy doctrine for the next 5 years. I know the ministry is working on along these lines, but such a doctrine must have measurable benchmarks to make our KPIs, you know, able to. The KPI reforms and institutional experiments, these will be given teeth if we have measurable benchmarks in the doctrine that will come for the next 5 years. 3, strengthen economic diplomacy units within our missions, leverage Ghana's soft power in peace building, democratic credibility, and intellectual capital. And then finally, invest in diplomatic professionalism. Please, because of the importance of these, let me say very quickly that historically, the durability of our foreign policy has depended on institutional strength from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, professional service. So it's important that the current debate over political appointments versus career professionalism should not be seen merely as administrative. It affects institutional continuity, strategic memory, and policy coherence. Countries with strong diplomatic cultures, they invest in career development precisely because foreign policy is long-term, not episodic. Concluding remarks. Foreign policy is the external projection of our internal strength. Ghana's ability to stabilize the region will depend on the resilience of our institutions, economy, and diplomatic culture. The Mahama II administration has shown energy and creativity in its first year. The task ahead, I dare say, is to anchor that energy within a historically grounded, institutionally coherent, and strategically calibrated foreign policy architecture. As Ghana prepares for her 70-year jubilee next year, history again entrusts upon our nation the necessity to link the celebration of that key milestone with the provision of essential diplomatic leadership that seeks to carry the rest of the continent on board the speed train towards building the Africa we want. Ghana and Africa must not only be present at the recalibrated global table, but we must help shape the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Lavo. Okay, everyone, thank you for hanging in there. There have been an insightful number of comments on the report and really just an assessment altogether of what we are seeing so far over the past year. I'm going to try and wrap this up in the next 15 minutes. So I'd like to invite our discussants who are still in the room to just come up front with me, to come up front here. And if there are any questions, I have some questions here, but I just want to check. Are there any questions in the room? I just want to get a sense of what I'm working with. Okay, I see one hand, 2, 3. Okay, all right. So please can I ask you to come up front? And if your question is directed to somebody, please feel free to mention their name. I'll start from this corner.
Okay, so
all right. Thank you very much. I would like to say that this has been a very, very educative and inspiring session. And we've heard a number of things. I personally would say I have learned a lot being here. I think that in doing, I'll make a commentary, but let me just go ahead and ask my question. My question is actually on the environment. And I didn't get clearly an impression that there was a proper understanding of the environmental challenges that we had, apart from not even looking at the full scope of the environment in terms of adding climatic issues, but focusing on what eventually we call Galamsey. So I think that it is, how do you really focus on the environment in terms of addressing the issue of what we call Galamsey? Because I don't see whether there's a clear direction in terms of it. And I will say exactly what I want to say. The issue is, do you see this environmental problem as an illegal mining issue or Galamsey? Because as a history student, I know what Galamsey is. And Galamsey is not what we are doing. We are doing illegal mining. Do you see it as an illegal mining for which we are being unable to do the required action to address it?
Thank you very much. I will take another question. I saw your hand up here.
Thank you. Kojo was doing a presentation. And discipline, bribery and corruption that we have to really deal with when it comes to especially the subjects of human rights. And I think you were making reference to a situation, I can't really recollect. My question is, which institutions are responsible for sensitizing Ghanaians on the laws and their human rights without being exploited. Because we tend to say, oh, we don't know the law, we're ignorant of the law, and then we want to pay the police or someone. And it's not the right way to go, in my opinion. If we really want progress, we need to find ways to educate so that we don't have an excuse. So which institutions are responsible? My next question is directed to Professor Magashi. Colonel Abaji made a solid point on unemployment as the underlying cause to Galamsey, and I 100% agree with him, and other speakers touched on it. Are there any alternative job opportunities, income generating activities that are available for those who are actually involved in Galamsey, or we're just going to have to tackle Galamsey and leave these guys unemployed? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a third hand. It was your hand. Yeah.
My name is James Aveji. I work with Joy News. I want to direct the first one. We've spoken to Colonel Festus Aboagye a few times on the absence of a substantive defense minister. I was a bit surprised that that didn't feature in the assessment process, because since August 2025, Ghana has not had a substantive defense minister till now, and the threats around us is increasing by day. Just last few days, we lost 7 people in Burkina Faso, and wanted to know what the CDD's own assessment of this is with regards to whether or not it poses a threat to us or exposes us, and how much exposure do we have in terms of this. Then my second one would be on Dr. Pumpuni spoke about the removal and the appointment of the Chief Justice. The twin to that is appointment and removal of the other independent institution heads, especially the Electoral Commission. The CJ's verdict just came yesterday on Jean Mensah. When Charlotte Osei was removed, the CDD's position has been that the statement of misbehavior, which is procurement breaches, even though that has been established, it doesn't warrant a harsh punishment like removal from office. This new verdict looks like the other way around. It says there is the concern about serious constitutional and administrative breaches in the petition that have been raised, but it does not warrant the removal, the state establishment of a prima facie case. I just want to know the CDD's position on this as well, coming from the CJ on the same subject or a similar subject. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all of you, great assessment givers, and your equally great discussants. I just have one small critique to launch, that in listening to all of this, I wasn't always sure that we were keeping close enough to the issues of democracy and accountable governance. And that, to me, an assessment done by a CDD Ghana is primarily a focus on how all these efforts are conducing to or not conducing to democracy and accountable governance. And so, to come specifically to some of the submissions, yes, I would agree very much that one of the most important steps that President Mahama took in his first year towards improving political governance in Ghana and perhaps putting Ghana on a better developmental footing with the Constitution as an engine was the establishment of the CRC. But question is, 1 year, The CRC was supposed to complete its work in about 3 months. It moved to 6 months, and then it finishes work before the end of the year. Where is the report today? I think it's an important gap, and maybe it's something that we should frame as a question coming out of this assessment. Again, reflecting the sometimes unfortunate lack of attention to a proper democratic governance metric. Because somehow we seem to consider the fact that Ghana made pronouncements on Gaza and Venezuela that were generally pro-democratic and in accordance with international norms of respect for sovereignty of countries, for respect for the human rights of the people who live in this country. From that standpoint, I think Ghana did a good thing by the comments that it made on Gaza and Venezuela. So again, it comes as a surprise to me that that will be seen as a point to critique in an assessment of this nature. Then also, I love very much the point about tackling the Galamsey menace from the standpoint of removing the political sources, which are the real sources, the real origins of the Galamsey problem, and why we are unable to deal with it. And a simple question I would have asked in this, that we could have asked in this assessment is, to what extent is the government, the Mahama administration, removing the element of politics from who is given mining license, who is tackled when they are abusing their license and mining irresponsibly, and so on. I think looking at the challenge of governance at Galamsey through this lens may get us far ahead than we are so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, so I think I will give our discussants to respond to the questions that have been posed so far. Kojo, I can start with you. Was it Kojo and CDD? Fire to the question.
Thank you very much. So, yes, the question about the independence of independent governance institutions, it's true. I think the Constitutional Review Committee proposals around appointment and removal is not just about judicial independence, about electoral commission, about the Auditor General, about all of that. It's the same problem. When people perceive that the process of appointment is within it's not transparent enough, it's not meritocratic, then they believe that it can be interfered with. And that if you are in the political game, the more you control the person that is making that decision, the better for you. We have to remember that this whole problem now we have with judicial independence really started after the 2012 election petition. Once judges begin to have a say as to who has won elections or have lost elections after the people have made their choice, then the incentive was that we have to control that. And so the only way you are going to try and cure that process is to provide safeguards in terms of we all believing that the way we appoint the person, nobody can interfere. And then it's not so easy to also remove the person. So these are the things that I think we have to address. And I believe that we should go and look at what the CRC has proposed in terms of the appointment and the removal process. On the specific question about the decision of the CJ to make a case of making a no prima facie case against, I think, both the SP and then the Electoral Commission. From what I read, the argument that, or the finding, is that what has been presented as petition are really constitutional arguments. You know, the challenge with all of these things is that this is a process where you cannot see what is inside the process. Even the petitions are not supposed to be known. So as citizens, how are we supposed to make a judgment as to whether the CJ is acting, you know, without political interference or not? So it has to be reformed. But from what I was reading, it was basically alluding to the fact that these petitions are around constitutional issues and so on, and not actual behavior that may be seen as misstated behavior or criminal behavior or anything like that. If you take the Charlotte case, it was procurement breaches, and you can see, even in the Tokuno case, that where you have clear criminal offenses, it's easier for a conclusion to be. But when you go and talk about incompetence and so on, it's very difficult for petitions to establish that, and most committees that seem to have gone away from that. But the point has been made that these grounds need to be properly, if you are saying that somebody has been removed from office for offenses or grave misconduct or whatever, there needs to be some words that clearly establishes what these mean in real fact. And I think, again, the constitutional review process have tried to do that. So the solution, as we have said from the beginning, is that you can keep replacing people, but the governance architecture as it is now does not enable for the securities that we want for independent governance institutions. Yes, on the NCC, yeah. Who is responsible? So I think every time we come and we talk about NCC, and the fact that Ghanaians feel not satisfied that NCC is doing its job, NCC will say we are not getting enough funding. I mean, even sort of basic things. I mean, we are talking about Galamsey and the threats to food sources, water sources, and so on. Even where do you get that information from? If you are a citizen, these days young people don't even listen to radio. They don't watch television. They might get their news from Instagram, or because they are following Shatawale or something like that. So what are we doing in terms of education on a daily basis, on everything? So, people are complaining of some health, who is telling us about, oh, this thing that has come, this is what we used to, when we were growing up, when there was only one television station, you all sit on Sunday, you watch the news and you wait for Obra. Obra would teach you so many different things. It could be a public health matter, it could be, but everybody knows that this happened in society. And then they'll give you some sort of, I think it's that kind of thing that you want on a regular basis on, there are constitutional issues, how are these things, people to just get the knowledge, who is responsible for what. District assembly laws, somebody goes to build under a bridge and all of those things. But I think we are not getting more of that. And the question is that NCC says we need resources. We are not getting the resources. And we keep talking about it. The question that's been asked is, when are we going to resolve these things once and for all? If we all say it's important, why are we not resourcing NCC to do the job? And I think that's really the fundamental question. Yes, why we haven't had the defense minister. The government didn't start out that way. It had a defense minister, and unfortunately, defense minister. So I don't think that is a policy. If now the government is pivoting and is thinking that is how it wants, these are the issues that we are raising about the governance architecture around security. We cannot be reacting. There has to be a clear, conceptual, coherent direction about how we want to manage our security services to make sure that it's transparent, accountable, and so on and so forth. All these issues are important. We have talked about making a minister for security, national security. We did that and put that in a Security and Intelligence Act. But we keep sort of playing around with it, how we should do this architecture. And sometimes it's driven by personal decisions and so on. What we are saying is that this security, given what we have around us, we cannot be reactive. There has to be a very clear direction as to how we want to organize our security architecture. So, as you are saying, can the Minister for Interior handle both domestic and national defense? Now, when you talk about national defense, now you have to think about cybersecurity in a very big way. So, is that really? I mean, is that realistic for that to happen? And I think those are the things we have to interrogate and hold our government accountable.
Thank you very much. Dara, will you take the environment, illegal mining,
Yes, thank you for those questions. First of all, I think the term galamsey has evolved. When we use the term galamsey, it's referring to both illegal and irresponsible mining. And we have both large-scale companies engaging in galamsey. We have small-scale mining companies engaging in galamsey, and there are those on the side. Because we need to appreciate the fact that there are certain people who have the license and the permit, but who are also not being compliant with the regulation best practices on the ground. So as practitioners, we have come to put all of those into one big basket so that we make sure that if you're a big company, you have a responsibility to ensure that you do the right thing. And if you are mining without the necessary permits, you go and get it. So I think we need to appreciate the fact that the term has evolved, and within that context that will work. Now, there was also the question about what about the other issues of the environment. I have to say, they are all relevant. There are several national processes ongoing. But the truth is that the extent and nature of galamsey has drowned all of them. There are a lot of national level projects on climate, mitigation actions, and all of that. If you go to the communities, galamsey is practically removing restoration activities going on, interventions going on. So every intention of climate or carbon mitigation is being eroded. So those discussions are ongoing, but galamsey, in terms of the fact that it affects our food, it affects our water, even climate action, and the fact that it also affects our health, drowns everything else and makes that discussion much more topical. Now, there's also the question about whether we can create job opportunities for people already engaged in galamsey. The truth is, yes, there's the challenge of people getting into galamsey because they don't have jobs. I see those people as victims of a market or a process. But let's ask ourselves, there were several years back, say 15 years ago, when we didn't have jobs as well, did people think about going to do galamsey? Not really. People were thinking about going to do cocoa farming. Now you see people thinking, I am unemployed, and what they think about is that, let's go to where we can do galamsey. Even graduates get up, I don't have a job, they go to areas where they can do galamsey. So there's a certain level of lapses in the regulation and compliance that is allowing people to think that if I don't have a job, I can engage in an illegality. That is wrong. And the truth is, with how much galamsey people are making in a day, there is no job that can satisfy the current tests or the current, what I would say, economic interest or economic benefit they're experiencing. So we must deal with galamsey, yes, both in looking at the job creation aspect, but also we need to add some sort of stake approach to it, where enforcement and compliance becomes a key part, even as we explore incentives for people in communities who need jobs. Then there's also the question of to what extent is the government really addressing the political aspect of this whole thing. I think that so far, on our side, we think that there's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a lot of feet dragging. There's already been reports of people in government who are exposed to, as politically exposed persons engaging in galamsey, but the response measures are not swift. It is dragged. For example, last year there was a talk about some members of the high-ranking officers of the NDC involved in, supposedly involved in galamsey. The government came out and said they are going to investigate. As we speak, nobody has seen a report on that. IOCO has not come out with any findings on that. And there are day and day reports about other people involved. Look at how the issue about tax for galamsey is also being treated. So the response to the issues and even in addressing the political exposure and risks or their involvement is too slow and it's not as decisive as you expect. So these things can also sort of fuel the impunity and allow galamsey to continue. Thank you.
Professor Megashi, I don't know if he's still online with us. There was the question on jobs as well, which Darryl has tackled. Speak on that. There also was another question on economy, and it's summarized in a number of things is this idea of why is it lots of the macro stability that people are talking about, it doesn't feel like it's translating at the household level. Is it a time thing, as in is it too early? Are people not understanding, or is it just wrong instruments being used and that's why people don't feel it? And then the third question is, the currency apparently is doing well. Poor prices are dropping, but traders, market women are charging exorbitant prices and nothing seems to correlate with what's being done. Is there any action that the government is taking, should be taking, or can take to address the behaviors that we are facing with traders and market men and women? Professor Megashi, are you there?
Okay, so can you hear
Can
me?
you hear me? Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I didn't get. I thought you had said that Mr. Bosu had answered the question that I was asked, but I picked the one on the Galamsey and the one on why prices are falling and people can't. What was the last one you asked? The last question, please. Okay. So the first thing is that I think Mr. Darabosu has answered the Galamsey question, and Mr. Charles Aheto Chega, I think he was the man I saw, also asked whether what we're doing is illegal mining or is it Galamsey, and Mr. Bosu said there's illegal and irresponsible mining. So I think it talks to our capacity and our seriousness as a nation. We allowed this thing to fester for 20 years, 15 years, and now we're saying people don't have jobs, so can they do it? Now, in no serious country, can you justify an illegality because you don't have a job? Otherwise, somebody can go and steal as well. The armed robber also doesn't have a job, or they don't. So if it's illegal, we have to enforce the law, and if it's legal but irresponsible, they have to be compliant. And in terms of work, that's tough. But India, for example, has something called the National Employment Guarantee, where if you're an able-bodied person, you are entitled to some X number of hours of construction jobs, government construction jobs. So all the government construction jobs, they get this young man to show up if they want, and they can carry cement or dig a hole or do stuff like that. So it's been a while since I looked at it, but India had something like that. That could help. Now, to the question about why prices are falling and while inflation is low, but we don't see it. The basic thing is that a fall in inflation doesn't mean a fall in prices. That's what it means. So if a car is traveling at 100 kilometers per hour and it reduces its speed to 80 kilometers per hour, it doesn't mean the car is not moving forward. It's still moving forward. It's just that it's moving forward at a slower pace. So in almost every economy, what happens is that inflation is always positive. Prices are always rising. That's why our grandmothers and grandfathers or fathers would tell us that during the Gold Coast, something sold at £2 or £1. But what happens is that in these economies, where there are social safety nets, and there are ways that incomes try to keep up with the prices. And that's the problem we have in countries like Ghana, where even if the economy is growing, the gains of growth are not shared. So there are people left behind. So that has to do with proper regulation. So one way is proper regulation. Enforcing. When was the last time you heard in Ghana that somebody had gone to jail for not paying the minimum wage? I've never heard that before in Ghana. But in places like Canada and US, it's illegal. If you don't pay, if there's a minimum wage, you pay below the minimum wage, that is a problem. So it has to do with the way we are structured, the way we enforce our laws, the way we govern ourselves. All these things.
Ourselves for lack of agricultural policies to produce ourselves for lack of agricultural policies to produce what we need to eat, and allowing a country to use what we need to eat, and allowing a country that is, afflicted by conflict to, afflicted by conflict to produce what we need. When this government run by a soldier, we need. When this government run by a soldier, a captain, says that I want to add value to my tomatoes and has built more tomato factories, and is now saying that all the tomato that I grow must be processed. The Ghanaian traders that I grow must be processed. The Ghanaian traders have the alternative now of not finding tomatoes around Ouagadougou or or whatever. 300 to 350 kilometers into Burkina Faso, a short distance from the Malian border. So they went into the conflict, which ordinarily they shouldn't have, even if the government had not raised any travel advisory. We're sitting in Ghana, we know what the situation is. So I don't want to take Honorable Kojo Opon Kroma on, but what I want us to do is to disabuse our minds that Titao incident is a lack of rational foreign policy by getting too close to the Burkina base. In fact, the terrorists themselves have come out on social media to say that they were not targeting Ghanaians. They were targeting a military unit, a base. And then after that, they were looting the market. And unfortunately, the traders were found at the marketplace. So I think we can revert back to some of the expert, discussions that have been given around foreign policy and so on. My last point is on the MOD thing. It's baffling. Even in the Constitution, when MPs and other executive, persons cease to fill those positions, there are timelines by which the position. So even if the Constitution doesn't strictly prescribe a timeline for replacing a minister of a key ministry like Ministry of Defense, the number of months that is taking is baffling. And the Ministry of Defense is not about finance. Its issues are not necessarily financial, and its issues are not necessarily interior issues. There are far many technical issues within the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces. So maybe all we can do is to keep asking the government, when are you going to find us a new Ministry of Defense? But if we are not careful and we have a real challenge, well, I cannot speak for the government, but I don't need to now pay or face consequences. That's all I can say. It's baffling. And I don't understand why the government has not come out. It said by the end of the year, into early this year. We are now 2 months into the year, and we still don't have a Minister of Defense. And there are brains, there are people who can fill the position. Within the NDC party, it can find people who can become ministers. So what is it that is preventing the government for nominating a new minister? That's a $100 million question. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Unfortunately, I would have this session to a close. Before I hand over to Kojo, I would like to say thank you to everyone who was here in the room, to all those who joined us online, and especially to the discussants. We're extremely grateful for your comments. And now, close it off and we can all go home.
Thank you very much, Marie. Let me thank you first. As I always do, I come short notice and I try to impose my will on everybody. But thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this. This was initially supposed to be a 3-day event. as you can see, these matters really need interrogation. And we've tried to compress it into a 3-hour or 4-hour event. So I understand the questions and the queries and the recommendations to expand and interrogate and deepen, but it was also meant to provoke a discussion and a reflection about what has happened in the first year, because there are really very significant and substantial challenges that Ghana is facing. I mean, when the president, in one of his, I think his meeting with the leadership of NAT, said that if he fails, he's afraid that there will be a civil unrest or some, because the youth are looking to him to make a difference. So people have gone through 1 year, they are looking at the signs, they are now in second year. You know, this is not waiting for the coming of Christ. By second year, they want to see that the things are translating into actual results. So the earlier we reflect and see where the gaps are, draw the government's attention, get a better appreciation of what's going on, I think the better. Because if any government succeeds, the citizens will succeed. You know, and we've been on this journey, I say, from maybe around 2014 onwards, you know, where you get this high expectation and then you get disappointment. You get this high expectation. So what we should remember is that it's not a moment in time. Ghanaians are traumatized by, you know, promises and disappointment. Promises and disappointment. And that's where we are. And that's why we are so, you know, we don't trust government, we don't trust what people say, we don't trust institutions, we are not sure where this democracy is going, all of that. So confidence in leadership is very important. And that can only be done by deeds and not just by words. So I think these kinds of reflection are very, very important. What we have done with and I hope you can put the QR code there, Jonah, can put the QR code there. You can access the report. This is a pre-roundtable report. We are going to draw on the reflections from our discussants, and some of them have been excellent, brilliant, and try and incorporate it into the papers so that we can share it, because I think that knowledge is very, very important. So we'll update what you have, but at least we'll give you access to what we have presented today so that you can also look at it. It's almost 100 pages, I have to tell you. So, you know, good luck. These days people don't want to read, but I hope that the chapter, the theme that you want, you can go and read that, even if you can't read everything. So that's the whole idea. But to thank our distinguished discussants who have, you know, taken time, our discussants online, Professor Chu, Professor Sari, our D&D fellow who was one of our authors, Dr. Kwame Sapon-Siedu, is also online, and all the authors from CDD, some of our young colleagues who have all done very, very well. We hope that this is the beginning of more writing, publication, and engagement on these very important policy questions. But thank you very much for staying and being part of it. You will be hearing from us. Please, if we don't have your contact, make sure that at least you put your name on your sign-up sheet. We can send you information when we have these engagements. So thank you very much. And thank you, Mary, for everything. Thank you.